Does the Bible endorse slavery? This is Wretched Radio. Pastor Jesse Johnson, Emmanuel Bible Church, also author at Cripplegate, outstanding website. You should visit it regularly. I plagiarize from him regularly, although unlike, some preachers, I'm actually willing to give you credit, Jesse, for the great writing that you do. Well, these days, plagiarism doesn't seem to be a big deal. Your doctoral thesis was on the distinction between American slavery and biblical slavery, both Old and New Testaments. Let's see what, if any, distinctions there are between those two industries, to see how Christians respond to the accusation that the Bible supports American slavery. So, the big generalization, let's start there. What is the big difference or differences between American slavery and the slavery that we read about in the Bible?
Well, American slavery at its core is the kidnapping and ownership of an individual in perpetuity. I mean, that's kind of the essence of American slavery. Biblical slavery in the Old Testament, certainly that existed in some of the Canaanite areas and some of the pagan nations. But in Israel, right in the Torah, in the book of Exodus, central to the Israelite understanding of slavery is that Israel would have a form of slavery, largely for the protection of the slaves themselves. It would be capped at 6 years of service as a slave. If a slave ran away from their master, they were granted freedom. It was against the Torah to send a runaway slave back to his former owner or master. Like, that was against the law. If a slave was injured, he was granted his freedom, or abused, he was granted his freedom. He got his freedom after 6 years. It was a capital crime in the Torah to be found in possession of somebody kidnapped for the purpose of slavery. So if you stole somebody for slavery and you were found in possession of that person, you would be put to death. So that right away shows the fundamental distinction between slavery in Israel and slavery in the United States. If that most basic part of Old Testament slavery was followed in the United States, there would have been no American slavery.
All right. With that generalization, you did say that this was primarily done for the protection of the slaves. Unpack that.
Well, one of the most common ways that somebody entered slavery was through debt. They would be owing somebody a debt and they couldn't pay. And you just think of kind of the Middle Age stories of the debtor's prison, where people are thrown in there until they can pay their debt, which of course is an impossibility. Israel structured around that by saying you could become a slave to alleviate your debt with a maximum term of 6 years. On the 7th year, you were granted your freedom. You had to have enough of your supplies to start a new life. And if you wanted to, after that 7th year, to return to your master, you could return to your master. You could go in willingly and say, I love Yahweh and I love my master, in front of a priest who puts the nail through your ear at the doorpost. And there's witnesses to this, so it wasn't compulsory. This was all designed to protect the family unit and to protect the livelihood of the slaves, those that enter into it because of their own debt. This was not God's design for people. And Paul picks this up in 1 Corinthians 7, where, Paul says, listen, freedom is better than slavery. We all understand that. But people found themselves in slavery through various circumstances, an injury, widowhood, selling your kids. You think of 2 Kings 4, where the woman says, she's weeping and she's like, my husband's died. My kid can't afford to work yet. I'm going to lose my kids to slavery. It was designed in that sense to alleviate the debt. And so Christian ethics, or Old Testament biblical ethics, come in and say, we're not just going to let families be ripped apart. We're not going to let people spend the rest of their life in slavery. We're going to give some guidance to this, that masters have to provide for their slaves for a period of 6 years, as a way to foster a kind of healthy environment in Israel. That made Israel, by the way, stand out from the other nations. The nations around them had slaves without protections, without rights. They run away, they get beaten, they get killed, etc. Their kids are enslaved forever. Israel was just fundamentally different from that. Deuteronomy 4 says that's one of the reasons the nations are going to come to Israel and see God's wisdom in how they structured their government.
That would be the difference between, we'll say, Old Testament slavery and the Mosaic laws that govern that institution and relationship, probably a better word, and American slavery. So American slavery, man selling forever till you die, mistreatment, and not being treated with a great deal of dignity. verse.
Yeah, and even in American slavery, I don't want to jump in on you here, but even in American slavery, there's this whole deprivation of rights. In Israel, slavery wasn't there. I mean, you think of the fourth commandment, right in the middle of the 10 commandments. The fourth commandment applies the day of rest to you, your slaves, any visitors, any foreigners in your household. Like that is in the 10 commandments. It's not confined to the fourth commandment. The idea is that God's commandments apply to all within Israel equally and without discrimination, even those who are enslaved.
All right, that's Old Testament Mosaic law. Let's fast forward to the New Testament, because of course we have the book of Philemon. This is Paul sending a slave who had escaped, apparently run away, who got saved. Talk about prophet, sends him back. What's the difference between the institution that we read about in the New Testament versus what's described and defined in the Mosaic laws?
Well, the New Testament, Greco-Roman Empire, Romans, very bad. The Romans took people into slavery by conquering their city. You rebelled against Rome, the whole city could be enslaved. They did kidnap people all the way around, North Saharan Africa, put them into slavery. They, brought in slaves from England and the British Isles. So the Romans definitely did kidnap people, sell them into slavery, treated them like property, deprived them of rights and all of that. The church is growing up in the middle of that. So it's fascinating to see how Paul interacts with that. I mean, first of all, the New Testament takes the concept of slavery and applies it to Christians, and positively and negatively. You were a slave to God, a slave to sin through your redemption, which is a slave market term. The word redemption is a word from the slave market, where somebody would purchase somebody with a cost from the slave market. The Bible speaks of us as slaves to sin, redeemed by Christ. God chose us, paid for us, ransomed us. We now have our freedom. But in our freedom, we're now doulos in Christos. We're a slave of Christ as a Christian. So you have freedom from the law, freedom from the power of sin, freedom from the slavery of sin, but you have a new master who cares for you and loves with you, Christ. Now, the ethics then, as that relates throughout the New Testament, Paul didn't lead the charge to overthrow Roman slavery. It would not have been in his capacity to do. Had that been his goal, he could not have achieved it. But instead, Paul really does undercut and undermine the Roman institution of slavery by what happens in Philemon. Onesimus is a slave, runs away. He's useful. Onesimus is a pun. He's useful to Paul. Paul finds him as useful and then sends him back to Philemon. Paul could have kept Onesimus forever and ever with a clean conscience. After all, the Old Testament law forbid him from sending Onesimus back as a runaway slave. And yet Paul undermines the whole institution of Roman slavery by sending Onesimus back. And he sent him back and he told Philemon, you need to receive him as an equal. You need to receive him as somebody who's helpful to me and useful to me. And so it's worth thinking, what does that look like as a slave owner? A runaway slave, you're supposed to receive him as an equal in the church. This letter is going to be read to the whole church, and they're all going to hear this. All eyes are now going to go to Philemon. I mean, what's he going to do? And you can see how that ethic, if you are living with that ethic, you cannot maintain the Roman system of slavery for very long. It eventually will be undermined within the church. Who cares about the Roman world? That wasn't Paul's goal. But in the church, they're going to live out that there is neither slave nor free, Jew nor Gentile. You're all under the foot of the cross.
Let's make a YouTube short.
Okay.
I'm an aggressive unbeliever, and you're evangelizing me, Pastor Johnson. And I say, well, the Bible endorses slavery.
Well, I would say 1 Timothy 1:10 says that slave owners, and the word there is kidnappers, those that steal people for the purpose of enslaving them, have no basis to be part of the church of God. They should be expelled. So God clearly condemns the kind of slavery we knew in the United States. He condemns it as wrong and sinful. But then Paul goes on to offer forgiveness to all those who put their faith in Christ. And by the way, in 1 Timothy 1, it's not just slave owners and kidnappers who are condemned. It's also those who revile their parents, the sexually immoral. There's a whole list of sins. He goes through the 10 commandments there. There's a whole list of sins that when you violate, you deserve God's judgment, just like the slave owner. Yet praise God, there's forgiveness through Jesus Christ.
See, you just can't see, because you're witnessing to me. You just kind of brushed away my polemic and turned it into a gospel presentation. That is so pastoral of you.
Set me up there, Todd.
I think that's outstanding, actually. I wish more shepherds had the heart of an evangelist that always want to be proclaiming the gospel. So the next time, Pastor Johnson, somebody says that the Bible endorses slavery, no, because you're thinking of slavery, the American institution. The Bible does talk about a relationship that is radically different. And the Bible is opposed to mistreatment. It's opposed to violence. It is opposed to owning people in perpetuity and certainly to kidnapping them. So the accusation is just downright false. Pastor Johnson, continue to be a good shepherd, continue to be a great evangelist, and keep writing stuff for Cripplegate, because I can use your material like nobody's business.
Thank you so much, brother.
You're great. This is Wretched Radio. Zaporizhia, Ukraine, just 40 miles from the war zone, but that does not stop the Tomorrow Clubs from gathering children, natives and refugees in Ukraine who have suffered great loss, sharing the gospel, sharing the love of Jesus. Would you please consider supporting the great ministry of the Tomorrow Clubs? Visit tomorrowclubs.org/wretched to help children learn to follow Jesus. Oh, don't worry. Your cake is going to be ready for your baby shower. Just putting the finishing touches on it now. Perfect. Yes, ma'am. You can pick it up at noon. It's just...